Thank you for joining us today and welcome to Astro 3D ECR Astronomers in Australia seminar series. My name is Anisha Harshan. I'm from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and I'll be chairing today along with my co-chair, Dr. Jeffrey Simpson, also from the University of New South Wales. Before we begin, it's important for us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were Australia's first astronomers, and we acknowledge their long-standing systems of knowledge on which we continue to build. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we are meeting today. I'm speaking to you from the land of Bedegal people. My co-chair Jeffrey, as well as our second speaker, are joining us from the land of Wallumedegal clan. Our first speaker joins us from the land of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all the First Peoples joining us here. And this series is facilitated by Astro 3D, the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for All-Sky Astrophysics in 3 dimensions. COVID-19 has, of course, affected our ability to travel and to present at international seminars this year, and especially for us in Australia due to our time zone constraints. This series was created to provide opportunities to early career researchers in Australia to reach international audience and to try to mitigate this disadvantage. A few housekeeping things before we begin. There'll be 2 talks over this hour. Each will be 20 minutes in length and 5 minutes for questions at the end of each talk. I ask you to please save your questions until the end of each talk, or else feel free to use the chat function to ask your questions if you prefer, and Jeffrey can read them out. These talks are being recorded and will be placed in Astro 3D's YouTube channel. And by being here today, you are agreeing to abide by Astro 3D's meeting code of conduct. I've already warned the speakers about this, but because of the limitations of Zoom, I will need to interrupt the speakers verbally to indicate 5 minutes mark. So let's begin. Our first speaker is Arianna Dolfi from the Swinburne University of Technology, who will be telling us about the assembly history of lenticular galaxies.
So first of all, thank you very much to everyone who joined today. My name is Arianna, and I'm a last year PhD student at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. And my PhD project, which I'll be talking about today, focuses on studying the assembly history of lenticular galaxies from their large radii kinematics. Here is a brief outline of my presentation. So short introduction, followed by the first project of my PhD, which focused on using observation to study the assembly history of a sample of L0 galaxies. And my current project, which focuses on using simulations of L0 galaxies and the globular cluster systems. And finally, the summary and conclusions. So lenticular galaxies, you can see here in this figure, are placed in between the 2 other main galaxy types of elliptical and spiral galaxies. They're composed by a central bulge component surrounded by a smooth disk that lacks the spiral arms feature of spiral arms and does not show any amount of star formation or very little star formation. The L0 galaxies are found to be more numerous in the local universe and towards the higher density environments. Early studies have specifically looked at the fraction of elliptical, L0, and spiral galaxies as a function of redshift from 0.5 to redshift 0 in rich galaxy clusters. And what they found was that while the fraction of elliptical galaxies was remaining roughly constant as a function of redshift, the fraction of L0 galaxies was increasing by a factor of 2 or 3 redshift 0, as opposed to the fraction of spiral galaxies that was decreasing. So this has therefore suggested that lenticular galaxies could be a result of, could be an evolution of spiral galaxies in galaxy clusters that quenched their star formation and lost their spiral arms due to the interaction with the environment through processes such as ramp pressure stripping, tidal interactions, or starvation. These processes are all expected to produce zero galaxies with more rotationally supported kinematics that that they retain from their progenitor spiral. However, zero galaxies are also observed in low density environments where the interaction with the environment are limited or non-existent. And this therefore requires additional mechanism to the formation of zero galaxies, such as merger events or circular evolution or gas accretion events. And all these physical processes are also expected to produce zero galaxies with different kinematics out to large radii. For instance, while major merger can spin up stars, a large radii minor merger are expected to spin down stars at larger radii, while circular evolution can also still produce more rotationally supported zeros. While if in a zero form is disk from gas accretion around a compact elliptical, then newborn stars are expected to have smaller amount of rotation. So overall, this suggests us that it is important to reach out to large galactocentric radii in order to disentangle between all these different physical processes. A recent work looked at the used simulations to look at the stellar kinematics of early type galaxies out to 5 effective radii. This figure here shows on the y-axis the lambda r, which is a proxy for the spin for the angular momentum of the galaxy, and is closely related V over sigma profile as a function of the galactocentric radius of the galaxy normalized by its effective radius. What they found, they identified in the early type galaxies 3 different V over sigma profile shapes. One profile shape that was peaked and outwardly decreasing, profile shape V over sigma that was increasing, and a profile shape that was remaining around flat out to large radii. And they noticed that each one of these profile shape could be linked to different merger and accretion history of the early type galaxy. But in order to probe the outer regions of the galaxies, so what we do, we can use discrete tracers such as globular clusters and planetary nebulae that, because of their brightness, they can be observed out to larger radii, where the stellar surface brightness becomes too faint, and planetary nebulae, because they're evolved stars, they're expected to trace the underlying the kinematics of the underlying stars, while the globular cluster typically are observed in the two population of metal-rich and metal-poor, which are expected as well to trace the kinematic of the galaxy differently. So the first project involved looking at the assembly history of a sample of L0 galaxies, or observed sample of L0 galaxies. This sample was selected this sample from the SLUGS survey, and these are all like morphologically they are not pure zeros, but they all showed evidence of a disk-like component. They are located mostly in low-density environments. So in field and small groups, there is only one clustered galaxy. And they were selected based on the available number of globular clusters and planetary nebulae, for which we had radial velocity measurements. So the aim, so what I did was to calculate the kinematic profiles, 1D kinematic profiles of all these 9 galaxies, And what we found is that six of these galaxies were that we here call a line, were showing for these 6 galaxies, globular clusters and planetary nebulae were kinematically aligned with the stars, so, which means that the axis of rotation of the globular clusters and planetary nebulae were consistent with the axis of rotation of the stars, which was also consistent with the axis of rotation of the galaxies. And also the rotational velocity were consistent between the tracers and stars. This plot shows the average viewer sigma profile as a function of the galactocentric radius, normalized by the effective radius of each galaxy. And the viewer sigma profile here is obtained by averaging the individual viewer sigma profile of the distant kinematic tracers of globular clusters, planetary nebulae, and stars. And from the comparison with previous simulations, we classify 4 of these galaxies as big and outwardly decreasing, while 2 of these galaxies as show more flat profiles, viewer sigma profiles out to large radii. On the other hand, the remaining 3 misaligned galaxies were showing more particular kinematic behavior. For instance, this one galaxy, the planetary nebulae here shown in green, they were displaying minor axis rotation with respect to the underlying stars. On the other hand, this galaxy in the middle, the planetary nebulae in green and the blue globular clusters in blue were showing a change of the kinematic position angle as a function of beyond 2 effective radii, while this last galaxy on the right hand side does not show any net amount of rotation. So based on the kinematic results, we conclude that for the 6 aligned galaxies, so the galaxies with the 4 galaxies with peaked viewer sigma profiles likely form through late mini mergers that enhance the velocity dispersion of the galaxy in the outer regions without influencing the central peak. On the other hand, the galaxies with flat viewer sigma profiles likely form through late gas-pool minor mergers, which destroyed the peak in the central galaxy. And on the other hand, for the misaligned galaxies, such as 2 of the galaxies, we show low viewer sigma profiles, a total radii, likely formed through multiple late minor and mini mergers, while the last misaligned galaxy that shows increasing rotation of the globular clusters and planetary nebulae, a large radii, that's likely the result of a measured merger that spun up the globular clusters populations, large radii. And please feel free to check these 2 papers if you like to know more about the details. My current project that focuses on using simulations to study the assembly history of simple or similar terrestrial galaxies from looking at that globular cluster kinematics. The simulations that I'm using are simulations from the E-MOSAICS simulations. E-MOSAICS are a combination of MOSAICS, which is a semi-analytical model that simulates the formation and evolution of star clusters, and EGOL, which is aerodynamical simulations of galaxy formation in a lambda CDM universe. In MOSAICS, so the star clusters are not resolved, but they are attached the star particles. And some characteristics, limitation of E-MOSAICS. So due to the limited volume of the simulation, it only contains very few massive galaxies. And the largest cluster has dynamical mass of 10 to the 13 solar masses, which is like Fornax-like cluster. So we are limited to, as well, density environments like field galaxies and groups. But this is fine. It matches also with our observed galaxy sample. Some known issues with E-MOSAICS is that it overpredicts the number of low mass star clusters with stellar masses 10 to the 4, 10 to the 5 solar masses. And the author attribute this excess of low mass star cluster to the fact that Eagle is not incorporating an explicit cold ISN model. So these low mass star clusters are not being efficiently disrupted by the interaction with the cold interstellar medium. And there is also an excess of metal-rich globular cluster in this metallicity range. However, in the case for our analysis, we checked whether this was causing any significant difference in our kinematic results, but it's not, luckily it's not. So the galaxy from the E-MOSAICS we selected from the visual inspection of the images. So we selected a sample of 50 N0 galaxies that also had a quenched star formation. So they had specific star formation rate more than 0.3 dex below the star formation sequence. Here on the left-hand side, the edge-on and face-on images mock SDSS G-band images of one of the S0 galaxy from our sample. And on the left-hand side is the histogram showing the stellar mass distribution of our E-MOSAICS zeros versus our slugs zeros observed galaxies.
Arianna, that would be the 5-minute mark, sorry.
Okay, thank you. And one thing we noticed is that the E-MOSAICS galaxies, they have big stellar mass, lower masses, and there is only one slugs L0 galaxy that has very low stellar masses. However, there is some overlap up to log stellar mass of 11. So the first thing, the main goal of this project is to look at the kinematic profiles of the globular clusters. And again, here we try to classify them in the 3 different profile shapes of increasing, flat, peaked, and outwardly decreasing. And in order to then connect it to different assembly to the specific merger and accretion history of the galaxy. Overall, for now, we find that the peaked and outwardly decreasing profile shape is the most dominant one, which suggests that the majority of the galaxy are dominated by minor and mini mergers. One last thing that I've been looking at is whether we can apply produce phase-space infall diagrams for the globular clusters. So in the case of galaxies infalling into clusters, here on the left-hand side, this plot shows the 3D velocity normalized by the velocity dispersion as a function of the 3D cluster-centric radius, normalized by the visual radius of a simulated cluster with its galaxies. And in this work, what they found that based on there is a correlation between the location of the galaxies in this phase space diagram with the time in which they infell into the cluster. So what I've been trying to look at is there a similar correlation also for the globular clusters that are accreted onto the galaxy. On the right-hand side here, this plot shows then the 3D velocity of the globular cluster normalized by the sigma 200 of the galaxy as a function of the galactocentric radius normalized by the R200 of the galaxy. And this is only for the XC2 globular cluster of one of the galaxy in our sample, and the globular clusters here are color coded by the accretion time. As you can see, there is not a strong there does not appear to be strong correlation between the accretion time and the location of the globular cluster on the phase space diagram. However, this could be due to the fact that as it may depend to whether globular clusters were accreted during a measured merger that may have deposited the majority of the globular clusters in the inner regions. So my conclusion, so from the sample of observed zeros from the slug survey, what we found is that mergers can shape the distinct viewer sigma profiles of the distinct tracers in our ASTRO galaxies, and depending mainly on the nature of the merger and the time of occurrence and mass ratio. And from looking at the simulation of globular cluster kinematics in ASTRO galaxies, this is still work in progress, but the main question that I would aim to address would be to outdo the globular cluster kinematics and that for the viewer sigma profile to relate to the assembly history of the L0 galaxies, since from the simulations we also have access to the merger trees of the formation of the galaxies, and whether there is a correlation between the accretion time of the globular clusters and their location on the phase space diagram, and whether there is a dependence on the merged history of the galaxy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arianna. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, that was great. It's very interesting stuff, this, and fantastic bases to use at large radii, somewhere where it's very difficult to get otherwise. I was very interested in the simulations and wanted to ask you, what is the most violent simulation, the most violent merger that something that you see as an S0 today can survive? That's the sort of first question. So I guess that's the mass ratio. And the second question relating to the same thing really is, I guess it matters quite a bit to do with the orbital dynamics of particular mergers. So for example, you could have two disks merging. If the orbit and the spins are aligned, that could potentially happen more gently than if they're misaligned, right? And I just wondered if you can learn anything from looking at these simulations about what mergers disks can survive and what mergers destroy disks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's okay. Yeah. That's really good questions. And so for the first question, so what if I well understood, it's the what's the like highest mass ratio that can destroy the disk. Initially, yes, it was thought that measured mergers would form elliptical galaxies, but then other people found that no, measured mergers can also form L0 galaxies, but more like L0 galaxies. The mass ratio range for the formation of L0 galaxies would be, in one work they show that it would be between like 1 to 3, between 1 to 3, 1 to 4 to 1 to 10 is the can say privileged mass ratio range, where L0 galaxies can form as measured mergers with like 1-to-1 mass ratio. They typically tend to destroy the disk.
Yeah.
For the second question, the orbital configuration, it actually can play a role when forming L0 galaxies and also in influencing the kinematics. Here, I wanted to show you these are the individual kinematic profiles of the 6 aligned galaxies for all the different tracers. And one thing we saw here for NGC 3115 is that the blue globular clusters in blue, they show like a peak in the rotation velocity, a larger radii compared to the red globular clusters. And this, from the simulation, they expect that this could be if this can happen, like this difference between the rotation velocity of the blue and red globular clusters population could happen if the mass ratio of the merged is like minor, like 1 to 10. But as the mass ratio increases, this difference should decrease. And same for NGC 1023, which also show the evidence of a bar, and what simulation shows that this bar could form. So if the orbital configuration of the merger was such that the spin were like closely aligned, then that can help the formation of a bar. So not sure if that answer your.
Well, it's certainly a partial answer, isn't it? Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, it'll take, it takes a lot of work to look through the simulations to look for these equivalent situations. And you already said you don't have a huge volume, you don't have a vast number of candidate objects, but getting started is already, progress. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, also for the simulation, I still have to, I've now started, and then, I guess the next big thing will be to look, the actual merger histories on the simulations as well. That will be interesting.